I never thought living in a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into a battlefield, but that was before I met Karen, the kind of HOA member who treats everyone else's property like her personal sandbox. It all started one late spring morning when I found a crisp, official-looking letter in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo and delivered with that unmistakable air of authority. My eyes immediately caught the figure, a $1,200 fine for violating community aesthetic standards. The audacity alone was staggering. Apparently, the way I trimmed my hedges and painted my mailbox violated some obscure regulation that only existed in their dusty rulebook. At first, I laughed it off, assuming it was a clerical error or perhaps some overzealous neighbor reporting minor imperfections. But then I realized the handwriting on the signature line belonged unmistakably to Karen, my longtime nemesis in the community. The same Karen who made a sport out of policing every lawn ornament, flag, and flower bed in a radius of 2 blocks. I felt a familiar surge of irritation and amusement all at once because, as ridiculous as it seemed, this was classic Karen behavior: punish others for their own rigid sense of control while pretending to be the guardian of civility. That morning, as I sipped my coffee on the back porch, staring at the perfectly manicured rows of suburban conformity that surrounded me, I decided not to react with immediate anger. Instead, I let my mind wander down a path I'd rarely explored, a plan where karma wouldn't just knock on Karen's door, it would come dressed in a very powerful business suit. I've always believed in playing my cards close to my chest, and in this case, the card I held wasn't just a wild card. It was a full house, a reminder that some battles are won not by confrontation, but by strategy, timing, and the quiet satisfaction of holding all the keys to someone else's leverage without them ever suspecting it. And Karen, bless her self-righteous heart, had no idea just how many doors I controlled, including the one that held the very mortgage she'd just put me on notice about. Over the next few days, I let Karen stew in her own sense of victory, all while quietly gathering the pieces of what would soon be the most satisfying form of payback imaginable. I went about my mornings like any other, jogging past the rows of cookie-cutter homes, nodding politely at neighbors who had long since learned not to mess with me, and waving to those who were blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. Meanwhile, Karen's HOA letter sat on my desk, mocking her overzealous dedication to enforcing rules that, to most people, were laughable at best. I remembered the countless times she had cornered neighbors over paint colors, fence heights, and flower beds that didn't meet community standards, her voice sharp and her eyes gleaming with self-appointed authority. And now, here she was, thinking she had me cornered with a fine that could sting anyone else, $1,200 like it was a king's ransom for nothing more than living my life as I saw fit. The irony, of course, wasn't lost on me. Karen had spent years under the assumption that she could wield her HOA badge like a scepter, controlling and intimidating anyone who didn't fall in line. Little did she know that while she was busy obsessing over the minutiae of everyone else's yards, I had quietly built a little empire of my own, one that included the very bank that held her mortgage. It wasn't a detail I revealed lightly. I let her believe that she had the upper hand, that she could enforce fines and penalties at will, while I sat back, hands in my pockets, savoring the thought of turning her little world upside down. That night, as I walked back to my house after an evening meeting, the setting sun catching the golden leaves of the trees lining our street, I allowed myself a smirk. Karen's power was superficial, fragile, and entirely dependent on others' compliance. Mine, on the other hand, was quietly absolute, hidden in plain sight, and soon, it would manifest in a way that no amount of HOA rules could ever prevent. The following week unfolded like a scene in slow motion, each day meticulously choreographed to reinforce the subtle, unavoidable grip I held over Karen without her even suspecting it. I began by paying close attention to her behavior, noticing the subtle shifts in her routine that hinted at stress, the way she lingered longer in front of her house as if double-checking every inch of her property, the frequent phone calls she made that were hurried, clipped, and clearly fraught with tension. I imagined her pacing her kitchen late at night, the find sitting on her countertop like a little monument to her frustration, and I couldn't help but smile. It was ironic, almost poetic, that a woman so obsessed with control could be utterly blind to the forces quietly orchestrating around her. To most neighbors, I was just another homeowner, a quiet presence who paid dues on time and kept my property immaculate, in other words, someone who was perfectly invisible in the grand theater of HOA politics. But invisibility, as I had learned, is often the most potent form of power because it allows one to operate under the radar, unnoticed, undetected, and entirely underestimated. Karen believed she was the pinnacle of influence in our little suburban kingdom, but in truth, she was merely a pawn in a much larger game she had no clue existed. My advantage was subtle yet absolute. While she wielded threats, penalties, and self-righteous indignation as weapons, I held the leverage of financial control. The bank that processed her mortgage, managed her escrow, and oversaw her loans was an entity I owned outright, and this was the secret she would never, ever see coming. I didn't gloat publicly. I didn't need to. Power, in its most refined form, doesn't announce itself with loud fanfare. It manifests quietly, invisibly, like the current beneath a calm river surface, guiding everything in its path with silent insistence. I reveled in this realization, letting it simmer like a rich, dark brew in the back of my mind as I prepared the next stages of the plan. Every interaction with Karen became an opportunity to feed her sense of dominance while simultaneously deepening her ignorance of the reality she was entangled in. I made sure to maintain the appearance of cordiality, waving when she passed in her SUV, nodding politely during HOA meetings, even offering the occasional casual remark about the fine, "Oh, that? I'll take care of it soon." Her eyes would flare with triumph, convinced she had exerted real pressure on me, while I kept my poker face perfectly neutral. Inside, however, I was calculating, mapping out the exact sequence of steps that would not only neutralize her threats but turn them into her own undoing. I reviewed her mortgage files, the interest rates, the payment schedule, the conditions tied to late payments, all details that would give me absolute power when the time came. It wasn't revenge in a rash, petty sense, it was strategic, precise, and, frankly, inevitable. Karen had written me a fine thinking she had leverage, but in reality, she had handed me a ticket to orchestrate the exact consequences that would make her finally understand the disparity between her perception of control and the true structure of power. I allowed myself to imagine her shock when a bank representative, or perhaps just a carefully timed letter from me, masked in professional corporate formality, would land on her doorstep, outlining the options she could take. And there would be no threats from HOA rules or neighborly complaints to mitigate the situation. The system she had trusted to protect her would now serve a far higher authority. In parallel, I began documenting every interaction I had with her concerning the fine, creating a meticulous record that would bolster my position and give me legal and social leverage. Emails, letters, brief hallway conversations during HOA meetings, each one became a thread in the tapestry I was weaving. I knew the value of precision and the danger of leaving gaps in the narrative. Karen, ever confident in her self-proclaimed authority, underestimated the importance of record-keeping and the subtle but devastating weight it could carry. My plan wasn't about immediate gratification, it was about constructing an irrefutable structure where every move she made, every assumption she clung to, would reinforce the inevitability of her predicament. I even began crafting correspondence that appeared casual, almost dismissive, designed to lull her into complacency, to make her believe she still had the upper hand, while I controlled the most critical variables in the background. There was an art to this kind of power, and I reveled in the meticulous craftsmanship of it. This wasn't simply about a fine, it was about demonstrating a lesson in hubris, about revealing that arrogance is most perilous when it blinds one to forces operating quietly, invisibly, and yet decisively. As the days passed, I expanded the scope of my strategy, quietly observing her social interactions and community influence. Karen's reputation as a stickler had always given her a certain sway, but it was superficial. People nodded, smiled, and often rolled their eyes behind her back, acknowledging her authority without truly fearing it. Meanwhile, I began subtly reinforcing my own presence in the neighborhood as a calm, rational, trustworthy figure, the kind of man whose opinions carried weight not through intimidation, but through respect and understated competence. My visibility remained low, my actions precise. The HOA could continue its charade of control, but in reality, I was the one maneuvering the pieces on the Real board, dictating outcomes in a way that Karen could neither anticipate nor counteract. Her fine, intended as punishment, became a catalyst for a far greater outcome, one that would unfold in a way only I could orchestrate. And all the while, she remained blissfully ignorant, operating under the comforting illusion that she was dictating terms when, in fact, she was dancing on strings I alone held. By the end of that week, I was ready to initiate the first phase of the plan. The documents were prepared, letters drafted, and my approach calculated to ensure the maximum psychological and practical impact. Karen, who had spent years believing her moral and regulatory righteousness could bend the world to her will, was about to learn that power is not always about the loudest voice or the strictest rules. Sometimes, it lies quietly in the background, in the systems that people take for granted, in the unnoticed influence of infrastructure, finance, and foresight. And when those systems were exercised with precision, there was no escape. Karen's $1,200 fine, once a symbol of her control, was about to become the very instrument that revealed her vulnerability, her dependence on forces she had long ignored, and her ultimate lack of real power. That thought, more than anything else, brought me a quiet, profound satisfaction. It was more than revenge, it was poetic justice delivered with finesse, and it was about to unfold in full, unassailable clarity. When the morning finally arrived for the first visible move in my plan, I felt a small, steady calm settle over me, the kind of calm you get before a tightrope walker takes that first confident step. For months I had rehearsed this moment in my head, laying out the sequence of events like a chess player lining up combinations, accounting for every possible response and countermeasure. The difference between a thought experiment and reality, of course, is the human element. People do unpredictable things when their back is up against a wall. But I had built contingencies into contingencies. Contingency A, B, and C were already synchronized with quiet, efficient legal precision. There were quiet phone calls to be made, formal letters to be sent, and the right mix of official-sounding documents to be delivered to the right addresses. I dressed that morning not in anything ostentatious, but in a well-tailored suit that fit like a comfortable assertion, neutral, competent, unthreatening. When you are about to pull the rug out from under somebody's ego, the least ostentatious outfit is the one that does the most work. I drove through the neighborhood as I always did, windows down, the soft hum of the engine and the morning radio providing a soundtrack that felt mundanely ordinary. I wanted every part of my presence to whisper normalcy. That normalcy, after all, was my secret weapon. Karen would be less likely to suspect a man who blended into the rhythm of the street than one who strutted on the stage and announced his intentions. My first move was procedural and unromantic, a formally worded notice mailed through the bank's compliance department to Karen's registered address, carefully drafted to read like any other notice homeowners receive. It was a letter about her mortgage account. Nothing inflammatory, just professional language concerning standard escrow adjustments and the importance of maintaining a timely payment schedule. But tucked into the body of the letter, in perfectly legal phrasing, were options and consequences that would only be triggered if she ignored a carefully orchestrated timeline. I had coordinated with the compliance team, whom I controlled through my ownership stake and the right, well-practiced management channels, to ensure the notice would be processed like any other. It would go to the exact place I intended, arrive at a time I judged optimal for maximum psychological effect, and be worded so that a quick glance would not necessarily reveal the gravity of what lay beneath. The artful ambiguity was deliberate, it invited complacency while quietly demanding attention. The next element was more visible, a certified letter from the bank's legal department outlining the potential for escrow adjustments should certain payments lapse. Legalese has a way of turning even the most confident into careful readers, and I knew Karen would at least skim every line twice. She opened the letter on a Wednesday afternoon. I had timed it for a weekday to coincide with the rhythm of the community's expectations. Midweek is when people are least likely to be leisurely, and worry, when it strikes, tends to be sharp and focused. I saw her across the street as I returned from a quick lunch. She was standing at her mailbox, the letter in hand, face folded into a map of concentration and confusion. The sight gave me a small, private thrill, not because I gnashed at her discomfort, but because the gears I had set in motion were moving exactly as planned. She read, reread, and then looked up as if seeking confirmation from the empty air that this was indeed routine. I smiled and raised a hand in an over-friendly wave, the kind reserved for neighbors who like to pretend everything is normal even when it is not. She returned the wave with a tightness that suggested she did not know which foot to put forward next. Her phone called shortly after, a sharp, desperate ring that I could almost hear in the way she fumbled with the device. She spoke in a voice too high for her usual baritone, words clipped and rapid. I could not hear the conversation, but the trembling in her hands told the story. Whatever narrative she had been living in, one in which HOA citations were the most serious threats she would ever encounter, was now intersecting with a system far larger and far colder, the banking world, with its punctilious schedules and indifferent, legalistic rigidity. The next stage of the plan played out in 3 separate but coordinated moves designed to stretch her sense of control thin and make her options feel increasingly narrow. First, I ensured the HOA fine remained on the record. It was important, psychologically, that the small personal grievance that had sparked this chain of events remained visible. It deepened the sense of cause and effect in a way that made her predicament feel self-inflicted. Second, I had the bank's customer service department, again, operated through channels she believed were standard, reach out with neutral, helpful suggestions about payment options, modifications, and escrow adjustments. These calls were scripted to be empathetic and useful sounding, the kind of calls that make a homeowner think, I'll call them back after I figure things out. Finally, and this is where the financial leverage secreted through the legal wording performed its cruel ballet, I authorized a slight adjustment to the timing of an escrow disbursement that, if not addressed promptly, would create the conditions for a late payment notice. The adjustment itself was tiny, almost trivial in financial terms, but its ripple effects could be significant. It was precisely the kind of thing a homeowner might miss while negotiating with an HOA or rearranging life to avoid a $1,200 fine. To Karen, it would appear at first as a bureaucratic snafu, an annoyance she could remedy with a quick call and a conciliatory check. To me, it was the fulcrum upon which her sense of control would be leveraged. Within days, she received a formal notice of late payment from the bank. I had imagined her reaction carefully. She did not react with the melodramatic hysteria some might expect, but with a controlled panic that made her even more dangerous. Control had always been her armor. When she sensed that slipping, she became surgical, calculating, and vindictive in ways quieter people do not often see. She began to push harder at the HOA, rattling off emails, demanding meetings, and escalating her rhetoric in board forums where once she had been content to drop passive-aggressive notes. She made a show of calling the bank, polite at first, then gradually sharper as she clutched at explanations and solutions. The community watched. People took mental notes. Some pitied her, others shrugged and returned to their lives. But what I wanted, more than anything, was to let the social fabric around her begin to fray just enough for her to feel the isolation of consequence. Arrogance is frequently a public performance. By making her stumble in public, I was transforming her private power play into a spectacle that would underscore the disparity between how she thought she moved the world and how the world, in practice, could move her. It is worth pausing to consider that what I did was not about cruelty for its own sake. I took no pleasure in seeing someone panic to the point of losing sleep. There is a difference between revenge that is pure malice and a strategy that aims to correct a balance through exposure and consequence. Karen had used the HOA as a bullies club for years, extracting small humiliations and enforcement penalties from neighbors who often felt powerless to respond. I believed in proportionality and in deterrence. If the message that came out of this had to sting, then it needed to be a sting that taught the neighborhood, and Karen in particular, that wielding authority with little humility invites a reckoning. That said, I also had a streak of compassion. I structured the final phase so she could step back from the brink without total ruin. I wanted to give her a clear, dignified exit if she chose it. People are rarely permanently defined by one moment of failure. Sometimes they are defined by what they do after that moment. I wanted to leave her the space to choose dignity, but I would not extend that space indefinitely. Power without accountability is itself a hazard, and accountability was the lesson I intended to deliver. One afternoon, a week into the escalation, an incident brought everything into sharp relief. The HOA held a regular monthly meeting, and as usual Karen strutted in with her ledger and a resolve that made others shrink a little in their seats. The room hummed with the low static of small social politics, the petty grievances, the polite laughter, the carefully staged nods toward democratic process. Karen began the agenda with a flourish, recounting her victory and levying the fine against me as if it were a medal. She spoke in absolutes. She punctuated each sentence with the moral certitude of someone who believes rules exist solely to sanctify their judgments. I listened from the back, arms folded, face an impassive mask. Some neighbors exchanged glances, a few smirked. I raised my hand when the floor opened for comments, not to rebut her accusations but to draw attention to the way we, as a community, had become comfortable with punitive impulses. We should be consistent and fair, I began, the cadence measured, my voice low but carrying. I spoke about governance, about due process, and about the necessity of understanding the broader consequences of our enforcement actions. In essence, I framed the issue not as a personal vendetta but as a systemic conversation, which, of course, it was. Karen huffed, she bristled like a dog sensing a rival. The board murmured, some members shuffled papers. Midway through my comments, she interrupted with a sharp retort, accusing me of deflecting and of being uncooperative. Her words were precise, intended to wound and to reassert dominance. But when she finished, a different sound filled the room, the soft ping of a notification on someone's phone, followed by a flurry of furtive glances. Information, in our age, behaves like a sudden wind. What had been held close could be scattered and become common knowledge in minutes. Someone in the room, a neighbor with ties to local news blogs and a propensity for drama, had shared the bank's late notice and the surrounding context with a community forum on social media. The thread grew like wildfire. People began to comment, to take sides, to post screenshots of meeting minutes and HOA bylaws. The narrative shifted thickly. What had been a small personal fight became a public debate about who enforced rules and why. Karen's posture, so confident a few minutes earlier, tightened as the crowd's mood altered. She realized that while she had been loud in a small arena for years, she now stood under a broader, more scrutinizing light. The social price of her authoritarianism had escalated. She tried to pivot, to reframe the conversation, to remind people of bylaw enforcement, of the need to maintain standards. But the air had already changed. Once people begin to reassess, they often ask questions they had not previously considered. Where had her power come from? Why had it gone unchallenged for so long? I could see the calculations in their faces, empathy, suspicion, interest, and I knew that the smallest civic crack can widen into a fissure when the right voices choose to amplify it. That evening, as the temperature cooled and the streetlights blinked on like tired stars, Karen arrived at my door unannounced. She had always favored ambushes. There is a certain type of person who prefers face-to-face intimidation to the slow chisel of public censure. She stood on my porch, flanked by an air of indignation and vulnerability that made her larger and smaller at once. Her makeup was hurried, her voice, when she began, was brittle. "You set me up," she declared, as if accusing me of a personal crime. The word "set" was meant to imply malicious conspiracy. I invited her in politely and offered coffee, because politeness is a neutralizer and because I wanted to keep her off balance. Over mugs that steamed between us, we talked. Her story was a raw, honest spin of betrayal and fear. She feared losing control not simply of property but of identity. To Karen, authority had been a scaffolding she built her life upon, and the idea that scaffold could be removed terrified her. I did not reveal my ownership of the bank in that conversation, not yet. Instead, I drove the conversation toward options and reparations, paying the fine, negotiating with the HOA, seeking mediation. I explained, in calm terms, how the mortgage world operates, what escrow notices mean, and the practical steps for resolving the late payment notice. I offered suggestions, stern, but practical, and told her there was time to fix things. Her eyes softened with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. This was precisely where I wanted her, in a place where she felt seen, heard, and grateful yet still uncertain of the full picture. It is much easier to lead someone to a decision when they feel that their dignity has been respected. In that moment, as I watched Karen clutch the edge of the table and look down at her trembling hands, I felt an unfamiliar stirring of conscience. Owning a bank gave me power, yes, but it also granted responsibility. I could have crushed her entirely, foreclosed the tiny sliver of security her mortgage represented, and walked away with the cold satisfaction of absolute victory. Instead, I chose to give her a route that preserved a measure of her life while forcing an honest confrontation with the consequences of her previous behavior. I proposed a solution that would require her to take accountability, public, if necessary, but which would spare her home and allow her to learn. She balked at the first hint of a public apology. Pride, like a stubborn thread, binds tightly to some people. But slowly, over the course of days and private conversations, she began to unravel the story she had told herself for years. The more the community learned about the cascading consequences of untempered enforcement, the more sympathetic ears she had to seek absolution from. It was not an immediate transformation. People like Karen do not mend overnight, but the pressure of vulnerability often softens the obstinacy that arrogance had cemented. 2 weeks later, the HOA meeting I had anticipated turned into an exercise in communal reckoning. With my encouragement and a quietly persuasive nudge to a few board members who had become disillusioned with Karen's blunt methods, we proposed a new approach: clear guidelines for fines, a mediation process before penalties, and mandatory education for board members on equitable governance. Karen resisted, of course. Resistance is the first line of defense for anyone losing unilateral control. But as neighbors rose one by one to share stories, small humiliations, petty fines, the suffocating effect of constant scrutiny, the mood shifted irrevocably. The proposal passed with a relief that felt almost physical, as if pressure valves had been released throughout the neighborhood. Karen's influence diminished, not because I had toppled her with a single blow, but because the community had chosen to reclaim its processes from the culture of punitive performance she had nurtured. She remained, of course, a human being with flaws and strengths, and I did not wish to erase her from the fabric of our community. Change is rarely absolute. But the lesson was clear and the consequences meaningful. Wield authority without empathy, and you may find the structures you relied upon transformed in ways that humble you. By the end of that month, Karen's late notice had been resolved. She arranged a payment plan, attended mediation, and, with visible reluctance at first, spoke at a subsequent HOA meeting about the need for fairness and the personal cost of enforcement. It was not a full mea culpa, but it was visible progress. I accepted her constrained gratitude with a nod, recognizing that sometimes justice and mercy must coexist. The $1,200 fine had ignited a sequence that revealed far more than the small sum it represented. It unveiled the hidden levers of influence, the quiet dangers of unchecked authority, and the way a community can, when prompted, choose a more humane course. My role had been decisive but measured. I had used my leverage not to ruin but to redirect. Power, I had learned, is not only about dominance but about the capacity to shape outcomes towards something more just. Karen's humiliation was not the point, her growth was the hope. As weeks turned to months, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Rules remained, of course, no one wanted chaos. But the enforcement culture shifted from punitive to restorative, and the board adopted transparent procedures that made future abuses harder to manufacture. Karen and I sometimes exchanged civil nods, occasionally brief conversation, and a wary, mutual respect that was less passionate than pragmatic. She had learned a lesson the hard way, and I, too, had learned that leverage must be tempered with a sense of stewardship. In the quiet that followed, I often walked the street at dusk and thought about the long arcs of consequence, how small acts can set entire narratives into motion, how invisible systems of power can be wielded either to crush or to correct, and how, in the end, dignity often matters more than victory. By the time the summer sun reached its peak, the neighborhood had fully absorbed the changes set in motion by that $1,200 fine, and the subtle power shift I had orchestrated became woven into daily life. Karen's posture had changed, not entirely humbled, but tempered. The swagger of unchecked authority had given way to a cautious self-awareness. She moved through the community with a new rhythm, her interactions measured, her criticisms quieter, her scrutiny less venomous. I, meanwhile, maintained my outwardly calm presence, a quiet pillar among the manicured lawns and white picket fences. The fact that I owned the bank holding her mortgage was no longer a secret, but it also no longer needed to be flaunted. Knowledge of the truth gave me peace, and the most satisfying moments were those when neighbors, blissfully unaware of the full story, remarked on how the HOA had shifted toward fairness, accountability, and reason. It was the kind of invisible influence that felt infinitely more powerful than any overt confrontation, the feeling that I had rewritten the rules of engagement without firing a single shot, without causing ruin, and without letting arrogance dictate the pace of justice. The narrative of control had changed entirely. Whereas once Karen had defined what was permissible, setting a tone of fear and micromanagement, the community now operated with clear boundaries, open communication, and, most importantly, accountability. Board members had been trained to view enforcement not as a weapon of personal authority but as a structured system designed to support the collective well-being. The lesson Karen learned extended beyond her individual predicament. It radiated through the streets, subtly teaching neighbors that hubris is often met not by chaos but by strategic, invisible, and inevitable consequences. It was a victory orchestrated not in public spectacle but in precision, timing, and the careful use of infrastructure that people often overlook, the kind of victory that resonates long after the immediate thrill has faded. Karen and I rarely spoke at length after the resolution, but when we did, our exchanges were civil, even tinged with reluctant respect. There was no gloating, no need for petty reminders. The mere existence of leverage, quietly held, was sufficient to maintain equilibrium. I had ensured that while she would remember the humbling experience, she would also have the tools and knowledge to navigate the community without repeating her mistakes. Sometimes, late at night, I reflected on the subtle artistry of the process, how small, deliberate actions, combined with patience and understanding of human psychology, could produce outcomes far greater than brute force ever could. True power, I realized, resides not in domination, but in the ability to shape outcomes with foresight, discretion, and a quiet confidence that few recognize until it is too late. In the weeks and months that followed, the community continued to thrive under the new governance structure. Minor disputes were resolved without drama, fines were issued with transparency and fairness, and Karen, once a figure of intimidation, became an uneasy but cooperative participant in the HOA. Every morning as I walked past the rows of homes, watching children play and neighbors tending their gardens, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because I had won in the conventional sense, but because the neighborhood had grown stronger, more just, and more resilient. I had turned a petty fine into a catalyst for positive change, using leverage responsibly, demonstrating that true authority is rooted in knowledge, strategy, and ethical execution. The story of Karen's $1,200 fine, once a potential flashpoint for conflict, had become a lesson in perspective, patience, and the subtle, invisible power of careful orchestration. And so, life returned to its rhythm. The streets were calm, the gardens immaculate, and the neighborhood, for all its rules and regulations, felt lighter, freer, and fairer. Karen, forever marked by her own overconfidence, had learned a lesson she would carry quietly, that power without foresight can be undone by those who operate in silence, with strategy, patience, and an unwavering sense of measured authority. I, for my part, continued to walk my path with discretion, understanding that the true victories in life are rarely broadcast, they are simply felt, experienced, and appreciated by those who understand the delicate balance between leverage, responsibility, and justice. The $1,200 fine was gone, but the echoes of its consequences would resonate indefinitely, a reminder that sometimes the most effective power is invisible, precise, and profoundly transformative.